Good morning, everybody. I wanted to give you some background information on John Edgar Wideman's story, Fever, in preparation for our talk on the discussion board. Now, Wideman's story, Fever, is the title collection to 12 stories that were published in 1989. John Edgar Wideman is a modern author. He is an African-American scholar and writer, and he lived and taught in Philadelphia in the 1980s. And when he was there, he started researching this historical event, which is the outbreak of a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793. That epidemic he is recounting in his fictional story, Fever. So first of all, what he's doing is he's using that epidemic as the galvanizing event in his story. And he's really examining the racial tensions that get heightened in Philadelphia by this epidemic and is comparing them ultimately to race relations that he sees in Philadelphia going on in the 1980s. So I want to do two things. One, I want to give you a little bit of background information on what yellow fever is and its history. And two, I want to talk to you about Wideman's story, and in particular, how he's using fever in his story. All right, so yellow fever is a hemorrhagic fever from the same family as Zika, dengue, and West Nile virus. What we know now is that this fever is spread through infected mosquitoes. And this fever is really dangerous, basically. In its initial phase, it can cause sort of flu-like symptoms. But in its acute phase, it can cause liver damage, leading one to become jaundiced, to have a yellow cast to one's skin. And it can also cause internal bleeding, the vomiting of blood, and ultimately multi-organ failure, leading to death. So in 1793, Philadelphia experienced its first outbreak of yellow fever. So much like COVID-19, Philadelphia was facing a novel virus that they didn't know very much about, and it seemed to have no cure. The outbreak began in late July of 1793. It lasted until about late November, so about 4 to 5 months. Now, this outbreak, much like other outbreaks we've seen in literature this semester, caused widespread panic in the city of Philadelphia, bringing commerce and really basic city functioning to a halt. The people who could afford it ended up fleeing Philadelphia for more rural areas to escape the disease. That was largely white residents. However, poorer residents couldn't flee, so they were left in the city to contend with the epidemic. Now, what Wideman really does is he reads this outbreak through the lens of race by examining the rise in racial tensions that the epidemic ended up causing. So what we can see if we study the history of the outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia at this time is a kind of evolution in racial tension that has a lot to do with how sort of white residents are viewing African-American residents. So during the initial phase of the outbreak, white residents actually blamed yellow fever on Africans. Civic leaders first thought that the fever was caused by Black slaves that were being imported to Philadelphia, actually from French Haiti, by their slave owners. However, as the outbreak continued, that fear that Africans were bringing the outbreak with them ended up extending to all African Americans. So white civic leaders began to blame African Americans as the cause of the disease and also as vectors of the disease. Now, as the epidemic spread and as white residents began to abandon the city, leaving behind their poorer neighbors, largely African-American neighbors, there ended up being a severe labor shortage in Philadelphia. In particular, there was a massive shortage of people to care for the dead and the dying. So civic leaders changed the story. And they began to claim that African Americans were not the source of the disease, but rather that they were immune to it. And what they then began to do is encourage African Americans to care for the white people that had been stricken with the infection. And from what we know historically, African American community members stepped up and began to do a lot of that caretaking. This effort was organized by two members of the African American community, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. Richard Allen becomes one of the characters in the story. They were prominent members of the African American community in Philadelphia, and they encouraged their community members to serve as grave diggers, carters of the dead and dying, nurses, and even what might be called physician's assistants. Now, the hope of Allen and Jones was that by serving the public, African Americans would eventually become accepted as fully respected members of the community. In fact, that didn't happen because once the epidemic was over, Philadelphians ended up turning on their African American caretakers, accusing them of negligence and abuse. That attack can be typified in the work of Matthew Carey, who ended up printing a blistering attack on African American caretakers. In other words, Carey and other white residents revised that history and misrepresented Black citizens, once again painting them as aggressors in this outbreak. Now, Carey's writing prompted a response from Jones and Allen, and that became the narrative of the proceedings of Black people, which forms the imaginative core of Wideman's story. So a little bit of information about Wideman's story itself. As I mentioned, the story in essence uses the 1793 outbreak as both an event, a plot point, and also as a metaphor for thinking about the persistence of racism in the US. One of the things that he calls attention to is the fact that African Americans were largely left behind during the yellow fever epidemic. As the poorest residents of the city, they didn't have the means to flee, and they also didn't have the resources to pay for physicians when they fell sick. Moreover, members of their own community had been called forth to care for white people at their expense. And so what happened was that African American residents in Philadelphia died in absolutely record numbers. The other thing that Wideman calls attention to is just the distrust and exploitation of Black Philadelphians by white Philadelphians, even as these Black residents are serving as caretakers to their white neighbors. And so by telling the story in this way, he reveals that racial distrust is a part of white Philadelphian culture, and that it ends up preventing them from recognizing their common humanity with their African American neighbors. So in other words, one of the things that he's interested in telling through his story is the idea that beneath all of our external appearances, we all have the same anatomy and ultimately the same vulnerabilities to disease. Now, fever is a difficult and challenging text, and I oftentimes recommend that students just kind of read it the first time over to sort of get the gist and some of the major themes, and then begin to really focus on sort of individual moments. So here's some of the things that make it a little bit challenging. One, it has multiple narrators. So the story begins with the author himself, who's sitting in his office. It then moves to the voice of an unnamed African slave who's in the hold of a slave ship. It also has other unnamed voices throughout the text, from various caretakers to victims of the yellow fever. And the voice we hear most often is actually Richard Allen himself, as he cares for the dead and dying. And then finally, we not only have multiple narrators, but we also have different types of evidence being given to us. In particular, we have these sort of personal accounts from different narrators that exist alongside autopsies as bodies are dissected and measured for medical books. And the other thing that makes it challenging is that you're going to move back and forth in time. So as I mentioned, in the first passage, you begin with the author in modern times in 1980s, and the author is looking out from his study in the wintertime and trying to figure out how he can tell this story. Then we move back in time to hear that firsthand account from the slave in the hold on the ship. And then we begin to hear from other people who are experiencing the outbreak. So we spend the majority of our story actually in 1793. We begin the story in the 1980s. We then end the story in the 1980s. And we go back to hearing the voice of a modern day Black worker at a nursing home who feels disengaged from his labor. And what he's actually discussing is a fire that broke out in the 1980s, which ended up killing several Black residents. And then finally, there's an autopsy at the very end of Richard Allen, who's the narrator who's helped all of the white people. So that's kind of the story. As I mentioned, I would read it for the gist. First of all, let the story kind of flow through your consciousness, and then go back and think about kind of the individual elements. And as you think about the story, think about the various messages that Wideman is telling us about how epidemics can get inflected in the United States by racial tensions. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll look forward to talking with you on the discussion board.